This is a sermon about lines. Lines that we have drawn, and lines that have been drawn for us. Lines that challenge us and lines that are challenging for us. And it's hard for me to think about lines without thinking about William Travis, because I'm from Texas. I'm from Texas, and in Texas you can't get out of the 7th grade without taking and being immersed completely in Texas history. Do you all have Missouri history in the 7th grade? We have Texas history in Texas. They immerse you in it. They make sure that you know it and that you remember it. And so as a Texan, or as Gary wrote on his Facebook page on a map that he posted yesterday, as someone who will always at least be a little bit Texish, I will always remember the Alamo. And I will remember it as we do in Texas, exactly as we want to remember it. With Fess Parker's version of Davy Crockett fighting until his last breath, and also with William Travis drawing that very important line in the sand. Now, it is important to note that historians cannot verify whether or not this line in the sand was actually drawn, whether or not this line in the sand actually happened, but it doesn't really matter because we Texans will verify it with our soul. We have been embracing our own truths long before postmodernity made it cool. So anyway, the story is that all these people have come from all over the place, and they are there at the Alamo to fight for Texas independence. Daniel Boone, William Travis, probably both Fess Parker and John Wayne's version of Davy Crockett, and a whole lot of other great people who are there to fight. And the fighting has commenced, and they know that they are overmatched and overwhelmed. But they also know that if they fight, they can make a difference. And so William Travis gives them this choice. He draws this line in the sand and invites anyone who will fight to fight, saying, if you fight, if you're most likely going to die, but if you want to fight, cross over this line. The story goes that all but one of those who were gathered there crossed over the line to fight and die for Texas independence. And all God's people said, amen. So Travis drew this line in the sand, and he did it because there are some moments in our lives, that we need the challenge and the clarity of a line. A line in the sand, a line that says, you're here and not there. A line that says, you're either with us or you're not. A line that says, there is no in-between. No matter how much you would like to live in the in-between, there are some moments when living in between, when refusing to draw lines and name what they mean, can be detrimental to you and everyone else. There are moments where you need to know where you stand. If you've been assigned a project, or you're working on something together with your team at work or at school or in an organization, there are points at which the other people on your team need to know that you are with them. And so, a line may be drawn, either to challenge you to step up or to step back, to step forward or to step down. And this is the kind of line that William Travis drew at the Alamo. This is also the kind of line that Joshua was drawing for the people of God in our story today. These people are getting ready to move forward into a new future together. And many of them are still holding on to the past in a way that could keep them from experiencing God's future. They've come from Egypt, and some of them are still holding on to idols and to little g gods that they'd grown accustomed to in Egypt. Idols and gods that have given them a sense of security and a sense of comfort. But God is calling the people forward into a new land and into new ways that will bring about new lives, that will bring about God's purposes in the world. And so they are at this crucial point where their leader Joshua needs to challenge them with a choice that he hopes they will all make individually and collectively together so that they can move forward. Joshua reminds them first of who they are and what they have come from. All that God has brought them through to get them to this place, at the cusp now of God's future for them. Joshua also then forecasts what lies ahead. Not with great specificity, but with great hope and great knowing that God is with them and God intends to bless them with the unfamiliar future that lies ahead. And then after all of that, Joshua draws a line. Now the text doesn't say he literally drew a line, but you can imagine it, and he at least metaphorically does with the essence of what his words were here. Verse 13, he says, "So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities from which you did not build, and you live in them and eat from their vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." And there it is. There's the line in the sand, the line that they needed drawn for them. Joshua needed to draw it because he needed to know who was with him moving forward. God needed to draw it so that the people could choose which side they would be on, which side they were going to live on. And we need lines like this in our lives too. We need lines like this. And we even need this particular line. Because you and I, if we're honest, do not always live as if the Lord our God is actually the Lord our God. It's always been important for people in our tradition, in the biblical tradition, to live with our allegiance first to God. We say that specifically for us, to live with our first priority being the God revealed to us through Jesus Christ our Lord. And to embrace this commitment not only in a way that shapes all of our lives and all of our commitments and all of our priorities, but also all of our families. And the calling upon all of our families. We pass these values and these commitments down to our children by living with them day after day, week after week, year after year, so that the next generation can be nurtured in them and claim them and live them themselves. That's actually what days like Promotion Sunday with our children are all about. We're passing on the faith. We're nurturing it in those we love the most so that they can take it forward into the future. You've got a lot of gods to choose from, Joshua says. Joshua's saying, now, today, make your choice. For you and your family, and for the future of your family, for the generations to come, for every generation to come, this choice of faith that you make or don't make will ripple down through your family and beyond it for generations. And all that I ask on this day is that you clearly make a choice and that you clearly consider making the one that I have chosen to serve the Lord. This may be one of the most important lines some of us may consider today. There are a lot of gods in our lives, after all. Materialism, consumerism, nationalism, partisanship, comfort, security. Even for some of us, other people are our gods. But whatever they are, whatever it is, there are ways of thinking and ways of being and ways of living that do not reflect an ultimate commitment to Christ, but to something or someone else. And many of us this morning need God to freshly draw a line in the sand before us, to show us clearly what side we are living on and what side we are not. So that we would know if we are actually answering the call to follow Christ or if we're not quite there yet. I wonder, in your own life, what kinds of lines might God be drawing now? Where are the lines that God is drawing for you in your life right now? And what would it look like for you to cross over those lines? And for us as a congregation, where is God drawing the line? Where is God drawing lines? And what would it look like for us to faithfully cross over those lines into God's future? There are all kinds of lines. There are the kinds we're talking about that I've been talking about, and there are other kinds too. There are God-drawn lines, and there are also human-drawn lines. And some of our work as the people of God is trying to figure out which is which and which lines we really ought to be paying attention to. And if you were wondering, the truth is, if we keep seeing lines that are actually serving as keep out signs, there's a good chance someone other than God drew those lines. For clarity, it's helpful for me to remember not the Alamo, but that God created in the beginning all things good, and said all things in creation were good, and said that humanity, the only thing God didn't call good, was actually very good. And so it's important for us to remember that we start from a place of not very broken, but actually very good. And what this has to do with lines is, in the world, often when we draw lines, it's kind of like this. It's like, this over here is bad and this over here is good. These people over here are bad and dangerous and risky, and these people over here don't belong here, and these people over here do belong here, and all of that. And we really do need to take a long, hard look at those kinds of lines. And we need to evaluate who it is that actually put them there and why. How do we get to this place, and what value do these lines actually have? Now, I don't know what lines you may be thinking about right now, but as you decipher through them, the ones that you've identified, the helpful ones and the non-helpful ones, it might be helpful to ask, am I on the side of the line that helps me live into the way of Jesus and what Jesus wants most for my life, or am I in another space? And a pretty good criteria, if you're wondering about whether or not the lines you are drawing and the lines you are crossing are where God wants you to be, is whether or not those lines and how you're dealing with them are aiding in your love of God and in your love of neighbor or not. There's a story in the Gospel of John about Jesus that you may remember, where he's teaching in the temple courts, and people are drawing around him, and they're gathered in large numbers, and they are because they knew what we claim to know, that the greatest hope for the life that is truly life is in Jesus, and they want to just sort of savor and take these words that are coming from his lips. And so they sit there and they've listened and they're learning from him, and in the midst of all of that, the local religious leaders come, these people who are in their society the guardians of all the most important lines. The lines in their culture between life and death. The lines between blessing and curses, between God's love and human shame and all of that. These are the religious leaders who are policing those lines for God's sake. They come to Jesus in this moment when he's teaching, and they interrupt him, and they do it by bringing a woman to him that they've caught in the midst, that's kind of weird, of adultery. And they said, hey, you're a great teacher. The law of Moses says we should stone her to death. What say you? And what they were doing, the text says, is they were trying to get him in trouble, hoping he would cross a line, that he would go too far and get in trouble with the authorities, too far for the people around him to feel comfortable with him and to stay with him. And so everyone there was awaiting Jesus' response. And do you remember what he did? Remember what he did? He got down in the dirt and he drew something in the sand. He got down in the dirt and he drew something in the sand. Now, nobody knows exactly what he drew, but he did draw something significant, something powerful, something poignant, so powerful and poignant that in that moment it protected this woman. So powerful and poignant that in this moment all of the people who were gathered around, their jaws dropped and then their stones dropped with them as they simply began to walk away. Now, Jesus was confronted in this moment with a deadly and dangerous challenge, and he knew that what they were doing was drawing a line in the sand, baiting him to cross it to his own detriment. In fact, he had to have known that if he messed up, they were going to get the opportunity they wanted to kill two sinful birds with one stoning. But Jesus remained completely calm in the midst of this storm, kneels down, draws something in the sand, gets up, offers them a word from God, and then kneels down and begins to draw again, and that's when they drop their stones. So what did he write? I mean, inquiring minds want to know, right? What did he write? What did he draw in the sand? What did he do in that moment? People have actually wondered about this for centuries. In one television depiction of the Gospels, they show this moment, and Jesus kneels down in the sand, and I guess they couldn't figure out what he might be drawing, so what he drew was an ichthus on that television presentation. Same kind of ichthus that is on the jewelry we give to people who are baptized here, and we tell that story about how early Christians would use the sign of the ichthus to let other Christians know this is a place where you're safe. You're welcome here, you're safe here, we're one of you, you're one of us, nothing bad is going to happen to you in this place. You belong here. I think it would have been really interesting and ingenious if he had knelt down and drawn in the sand Leviticus 19:18, which is the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Or even knowing that they must have known that so well, if he had just drawn in the sand the word neighbor in Aramaic or Hebrew. Others have postulated that what Jesus did was actually much more pointed. That he might have been actually writing the names of the Pharisees and Sadducees who were gathered around him in the sand, specifically those who had also been with this woman or with some other woman in adultery. Some people have wondered that. Or wondered perhaps if he was simply being very personal and writing out in the sand each and every single one of their sins, the ones that as they saw them appear on the sand in front of them would have made them so uncomfortable that they would have dropped their jaws and dropped their stones and begin to walk away. Where are your accusers? Jesus asked. Has no one condemned you? No, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now, here's the line, and sin no more. And then John's gospel says that he looked up at all the people who were still there and declared to them, I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Which all to me sounds like one more of those lines in the sand. Perhaps the only one that God actually ever drew. It does seem, after all, doesn't it, that most of the lines Jesus ultimately drew weren't quite straight, but actually arced into some kind of circle? Some kind of ever-widening circle? There's a story about lines and circles that goes like this. See if any of it resonates to you. Once upon a time, in a world of shapes, there lived two parallel lines. They were straight and proud, stretching endlessly in opposite directions. Though they were close, they never touched, always running side by side. They saw the world in black and white, knowing only their own path, straight and unwavering. But one day the lines heard whispers of a different shape, a circle, a shape that was whole, complete, and endless. The lines, they couldn't comprehend this. How could a shape have no beginning and no end? Intrigued then and slightly envious, the lines set out on a journey to discover the secrets of the circle. As they traveled, they encountered curves and arcs, shapes that twisted and shapes that turned. The lines at first resisted these changes. They were used to straight paths and feared losing their identity. But as they continued, they began to realize that the world wasn't just black and white. It was filled with colors and shades they had never noticed before. The lines then started to bend. First slightly and then more freely. They twisted and they turned, learning to embrace the unknown, to take risks, and to experience the beauty of the world around them. As they continued to bend, then they found themselves drawn closer and closer to one another. Finally, after a long journey, the two lines met, their ends joining together to form a perfect circle. They realized then that in their union they had become something new, something complete. The circle was endless, with no beginning and no end, just like the love they now shared. The lines understood that love is not about remaining steadfast and separate, but about bending and changing and coming together to form something more. In their union, they found not only love, but also what it means to be whole. Jesus wants something more for us too. Jesus wants for us to find out what it means to be whole. Jesus wants for us to find out what it means to be whole. And you know, from where we're standing, most of the lines that Jesus draws in front of us may seem small and straight, but the fact of the matter is, and we find this over time, that if we're willing to pan out wide enough, we may just see out there in the distance, on each side, that the line Jesus has drawn is bending and arcing. And if we were able to see it ultimately from God's vantage point, we might finally notice that the line Jesus draws is actually an ever-expanding circle of love. He wants us to cross over it to His side. And He wants us to bring others with Him. This is the character and call of Christ. And so, what will you do today with that? How will you respond today with that? Jesus has drawn the only line that matters. In fact, friends, Jesus is the only line that matters, and Jesus has called all of us to bring others across the line into His ever-expanding circle of love. How much does that matter to you? How much does that matter to you? However much it matters, With all of that in mind, what will you choose today? What then will you choose? How then will you live? May God grant us all the courage and the conviction to stand with Joshua, who proclaimed so many years ago, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."